a rerun of that experience. What's not in doubt is that the loose, multinational network of Islamic militants which bin Laden controls is well-funded, well-organized, and motivated by a burning hatred of America, seen as the superpower that's the #1 enemy of Muslims around the world. None of this means there's proof of bin Laden's involvement in Tuesday's extraordinary events, but it does mean he'll figure prominently in many people's list of suspects.
Our Middle East analyst, Roger Hardy. Whether or not Osama bin Laden is involved, the assumption's being made that there is a link with the Middle East, and there are already calls in the United States for drastic action against those responsible. Our diplomatic correspondent, Barnaby Mason, says it's a huge test for an inexperienced President, George Bush.
Immediate international reaction has been one of solidarity with the Americans. That was inevitable. But unease about how they'll react is not far behind. The United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan expressed it by saying that in such moments, cool and reasoned judgment was more essential than ever. To many in the United States, there's a war to be fought against terrorism. The impact has been compared to that of the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. But then the enemy was visible and numerous. This time, the crashing of airliners in suicide attacks, though stunningly coordinated, may have been planned and carried out by a mere handful of people. They are unseen, so far unidentified by the intelligence services that failed to prevent the attacks. But there'll be overwhelming pressure on President Bush to take action. One American commentator said it was not a time for routine investigation and judicial process. The United States should adopt the Israeli government's policy of killing those it holds responsible for organizing suicide attacks. After the 1998 bomb attacks on American embassies in East Africa, Washington launched missiles against targets in Afghanistan. A larger-scale repetition of that kind of response might only serve to increase the hatred of America, which lies at the root of the New York and Washington attacks. Whether or not Osama bin Laden was involved, a Middle East dimension seems overwhelmingly likely. The United States is widely seen there as the prime supporter of Israel and therefore an enemy of Arab and Muslim people. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict provides a supply of young men prepared to die, they believe, as martyrs. The question is how much new thought the Bush administration will give to its Middle East policy, or whether it will see the crisis purely as a battle between democracy and terrorism.
Barnaby Mason reporting. Outside the Middle East, there's been unqualified condemnation of the attacks, including from countries that have had strained relations with Washington. With this report from London, here's our World Affairs correspondent, Nick Childs.
It's a measure of the enormity of the images from New York and Washington now being broadcast around the world that international reaction has been so strong. From Russia, President Vladimir Putin deplored and condemned what he described as a barbarous, horrific tragedy.
Столкнулись с беспрецедентным актом агрессии со стороны международного терроризма.
We have encountered an unprecedented act of aggression by international terrorism. Primarily, I express sincere, profound condolences to everyone affected and the families of those killed. Today's developments in the United States go beyond national borders. This is a brazen challenge to all of humankind, at least to all of civilized humankind.
In Britain, Prime Minister Tony Blair called the events terrible and shocking.
As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it.
Governments around the world are still grappling with the magnitude of the attacks, wondering if they too might be targeted. Britain, like others, has tightened its own security. Many countries have expressed solidarity with the United States. NATO immediately held an emergency meeting of ambassadors. Afterwards, the alliance's Secretary General, Lord Robertson, insisted NATO stood united.
At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for both assistance and for support. NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you. Our message to those who perpetrated these unspeakable crimes is equally clear. You will not get away with it.
But in many capitals, there may also be anxiety about what Washington might do in retaliation.
Le peuple français, je tiens à le dire ici, tout entier, est aux côtés du peuple américain.
President Jacques Chirac of France was one of the leaders to cut short scheduled plans to go into emergency meetings. The leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Russia have been consulting by telephone as the international community tries to produce a concerted response. From the city of New York, a call from the UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan for cool heads.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated. And as such, I condemn them utterly. In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever. We do not know yet who is behind these acts or what objective they hope to achieve. What we do know is that no just cause can be advanced by terror.
As speculation continues as to who might be behind these attacks, there have been celebrations among Palestinians in the Palestinian territories. But the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, expressed disbelief over what had happened.
First of all, I am offering the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American president for this terrible act. We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Inevitably, there is much debate about a likely Middle East connection to these attacks, with the finger pointing to the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden. Countries not normally friendly to the United States, Syria and Iran, have condemned the attacks. From Israel, many leaders have issued a rallying call to tackle what they insist is a common enemy. And from the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, a declaration that the latest attacks constitute a turning point.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life. I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
Forging a united international response against threats like this hasn't been easy in the past, but the catastrophic nature of these latest attacks may change that.
Nick Child reporting. A reminder of today's main news. There's been a series of catastrophic attacks on the heart of American power in New York and Washington. Panic began during the morning rush hour as two hijacked passenger jets were flown into the World Trade Center in New York.
Big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was...
These people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Big explosions. Going back into the 8th floor. I said, this is it. We're dead. We're not going to make it out of here.
I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower.
People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Right, well, it's going down. Don't worry, it's going down.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear, ultimately. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Doug Jimmerson. This is a special news programme. We're breaking our normal schedules to bring you the latest information from the United States following the series of attacks on buildings in New York and Washington. Rescue operations are continuing, and we'll be running programmes over the next few hours with updates from our correspondents around the world. Many governments have put their defence forces on alert and called emergency security meetings in response to the destruction. We'll have regular updates with news bulletins on the top and bottom of every hour. And you can also hear our radio reports and background information on the internet. The address is www.bbc.co.uk/World Service, and World Service is all one word. Rutila Shah and Anu will take you through the next couple of hours with interviews and analysis and more on that story. You're tuned to the BBC World Service in London.
This is a special programme from the BBC World Service with Rutila Shah and Anu Anand.
Today, America remains in a state of shock after a series of devastating attacks in New York and Washington.
Hundreds are feared dead at the World Trade Center towers in New York City after they were hit deliberately by hijacked planes. The Pentagon was also hit.
Airports and government buildings also remain closed as America comes to terms with the worst attack in more than 50 years. Here's Roger Crisp with the latest.
There's been a series of catastrophic attacks on the heart of American power in New York and Washington. 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown directly into the twin skyscraper towers of the World Trade Center in New York during morning rush hour. The towers caught fire and collapsed. Shortly afterwards, another hijacked airliner was flown into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames. Part of its 5-sided structure collapsed, and it continues to burn. Another building near the World Trade Center, the 47-story Salomon Brothers building, has since also collapsed after catching fire. A 4th airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after being hijacked. A huge rescue operation is underway, and there's clearly been heavy loss of life. Many thousands of people were in the Trade Center, and the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. Several hundred police and firemen are said to be missing in the collapse. Some 260 people on board the planes are assumed dead. President Bush has consulted his national security advisors and is to make... And President Bush is about to be speaking. We'll go over directly to him.
Under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world. And we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President George W. Bush addressing the nation there, speaking, of course, in the aftermath of Tuesday's terrible events in New York and Washington. With me is Andrew Garfield, Director of the International Centre for Security Analysis at King's College in London. Andrew Garfield, President Bush there seemed sombre but resolute.
Yes, I mean, this speech is very important to the American people, and I think in the United Kingdom we underestimate the esteem that the American president is still held in by the people, and they would have been looking to him to provide the leadership, the resolve for the whole nation, and I think he's done that tonight.
He spoke of our country is strong, he said. We are a great people moved to defend a great nation. The Americans are going to fight back, aren't they?
They will. I mean, they can react in a number of ways. They can overreact. They can wait and find out who did this and then react with massive force. They can look at other options, diplomatic, economic. We really don't know how they're going to react to this, and it very much depends on who was actually involved, whether it was a single group, whether it was state-sponsored, whether they will go after people who have harboured terrorists or provided support in the past to this group who may not currently be implicated in what's happened yesterday, but who in the past have been very much supporters of these groups.
President Bush there seemed confident of support both within America and indeed from the outside world. Do you think he's right to feel that way?
Certainly, he will get the undivided and unequivocal support of the American people from all of the political parties and across all of the various groups. There's no doubt of that, I think. As far as support from the rest of the world is concerned, certainly he will get all the support he needs from NATO and also from his other allies around the world. There are other nations who would not be supportive of the United States at this time.
He also spoke there of putting the full resources of the intelligence services to find those responsible. One could argue that the very fact that these incidents happened reflects a catastrophic failure of the intelligence services.
That's been a common theme throughout many of the discussions over the last few hours. It's a very difficult undertaking to try and predict and forestall events like this, and indeed a number of terrorist incidents have been forestalled in the past, and that's not become public knowledge. The main way that one would find out what had been going on would either be through intercepted communications or through human intelligence, but an organisation like this is extremely difficult to penetrate, and so getting intelligence before the event is very difficult, although one could have a general feeling that something was going to happen. That's not to say now, though, that with the full resources of the intelligence agencies concentrating on this, that they won't find an evidential trail that they can trace back to the people who carried this out.
Andrew Garfield, thank you very much. Stay with us, though, and we will come back to you during the course of the programme.
Let's go back now to the events of Tuesday morning. You heard Andrew Garfield there saying that the investigation will be on find out exactly what happened, but let's go back to what we do know as to what happened. What began as a normal business day in New York was transformed into chaos and panic as a series of horrific events unfolded. Just before 9 a.m. local time, as people were arriving at work, a hijacked passenger plane crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess, because they're trying to see themselves. I don't know.
We're standing in front of the Soho Grand Hotel, and the doorman, I went to firewall company, the doorman goes to me, wow, I never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, and all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real.
The terrible extent of that first incident was just beginning to sink in when, 10 minutes later, a second airliner crashed into the World Trade Center's twin South Tower. There was another devastating explosion.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the South Tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
I was thrown to a window, so I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It was bad. It hit in one World Trade Center, it hit somewhere on the 67th floor. I was on the 56th.
New York's tallest buildings caught fire moments before the World Trade Center collapsed. People trapped inside were seen desperately waving from its windows. Manhattan was engulfed in clouds of dust and smoke, and the pictures were transmitted live on television around the world. But the terror was not yet over. At 9:45 Eastern Daylight Time, another airliner crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, the nerve center of the U.S. military.
There were intense fires following the aircraft's impact into the building. Arlington search and rescue personnel are just now, and it's about almost 2 o'clock, just now gaining access to portions of the building where the plane hit because the fires were too intense. The fires are still burning in the Pentagon, at least in that vicinity.
45 minutes later, it emerged that a fourth airliner had crashed close to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. The United Airlines plane had been on its way to San Francisco from New Jersey. A total of 266 people are believed to have been traveling in the 4 hijacked aircraft. Rudolph Giuliani, the mayor of New York, was one of many who looked on in horror as events unfolded in his city. He said he believed there must have been a tremendous loss of life.
I think it's going to be a horrible number. I saw people jumping out of the World Trade Center. I saw some of the firefighters who I know going into the building. And we were in a building in which we were trapped for about 10-15 minutes. We were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building. So we were trapped in the building for 10-15 minutes and finally found an exit and got out, walked north, and took a lot of people with us.
Well, there are still no official reports of casualties, but about 50,000 people worked in the World Trade Center, a symbol of U.S. financial power, just as the Pentagon symbolizes America's military might. A BBC correspondent, Stephen Evans, was in the New York building when it was hit. This was his account shortly afterwards.
I was in the base of the building in the foyer when there was one huge thump. It sounded like a full skip of garbage being dropped from a great height. I thought no more of it, but the building did physically shake. A few seconds after that, there were 2 more big crashes, and people started screaming around me and running, just screaming, "Get out, get out." We are now outside the building, a crowd of people looking up, and if you look up, you see the top, 10 floors of the building. Flames actually coming out of those floors, grey smoke billowing across a very clear sky here in Manhattan.
BBC correspondent Stephen Evans, you're listening to a special news programme from the BBC World Service.
Governments around the world, big and small, have meanwhile been sending their condolences to the United States. Many have been expressing their solidarity with President Bush and vowing to help find and punish the perpetrators. Our World Affairs correspondent Nick Childs has more.
It's a measure of the enormity of the images from New York and Washington now being broadcast around the world that international reaction has been so strong. From Russia, President Vladimir Putin deplored and condemned what he described as a barbarous, horrific tragedy.
Столкнулись с беспрецедентным актом агрессии со стороны международного терроризма.
We have encountered an unprecedented act of aggression by international terrorism. Primarily, I express sincere, profound condolences to everyone affected and the families of those killed. Today's developments in the United States go beyond national borders. This is a brazen challenge to all of humankind, at least to all of civilized humankind.
In Britain, Prime Minister Tony Blair called the events terrible and shocking.
As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it.
Governments around the world are still grappling with the magnitude of the attacks, wondering if they too might be targeted. Britain, like others, has tightened its own security. Many countries have expressed solidarity with the United States. NATO immediately held an emergency meeting of ambassadors. Afterwards, the alliance's Secretary-General, Lord Robertson, insisted NATO stood united.
At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for both assistance and for support. NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you. Our message to those who perpetrated these unspeakable crimes is equally clear. You will not get away with it.
But in many capitals, there may also be anxiety about what Washington might do in retaliation.
Le peuple français, je tiens à le dire ici, tout entier, est aux côtés du peuple américain.
President Jacques Chirac of France was one of the leaders to cut short scheduled plans to go into emergency meetings. The leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Russia have been consulting by telephone as the international community tries to produce a concerted response.
The other networks we've had in the past, and it's just a matter of time. We know what they're headed for. We know that they want to take our guns and our freedoms away. They want to disarm America. But I think we have only begun.
Completely. Unbelievable.
Inevitably, there is much debate about a likely Middle East connection to these attacks, with the finger pointing to the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden. Countries not normally friendly to the United States, Syria and Iran, have condemned the attacks. From Israel, many leaders have issued a rallying call to tackle what they insist is a common enemy. And from the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, a declaration that the latest attacks constitute a turning point.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life. I believe that together we can defeat these forces of